everything else was getting murdered, gold would be a nice strong opportunity to buy into, for example. But it's not so much the case anymore. Gold is like every other short-term investment opportunity. It's got a sentiment value attached to it. One of the things that I always check when I'm looking at sentiment is something like, and this is one of the things that the cryptos are good for, cryptos are good for sentiment. If cryptos are getting murdered, sentiment is poor. Stocks will probably be falling. Gold will probably be falling. People aren't buying stuff. They're buying safety. Gold isn't seen as that safe product until it's really discounted. So one of the things you should always look at when you're looking at gold as a sentiment situation is something like just simply Bitcoin. And if you look at Bitcoin today, you'll see Bitcoin has been getting absolutely murdered before the cash open there. So you can see Bitcoin is very, very bearish sentiment today in that US session. And with Bitcoin very bearish, that's generally a sentiment read in terms of the direction of your stocks and your gold markets and everything else. It has no impact on your Dixie. It's got no impact on your bonds, but it does have an impact on things like gold and equities. It's just something that you can read as a very, very sensitive measure for sentiment. Don't pass up on that little bit of sentiment. We have talked about Bitcoin being a sentiment meter before. I thought it was worthy of revisiting simply because obviously we've got this big disconnect between gold and bonds and the dollar seem to be correctly correlated. So when you look at the sentiment narrative here, then of course, well, it shows. It's not really the same as silver because silver's just going to do the same as what the rest of the metals market's going to do, whereas Bitcoin's got nothing to do with metals. It's a pure sentiment play, isn't it? Nobody buys Bitcoin when they're worried about the economy. It's just not the thing that people do. They generally, as a rule, buy Bitcoin when they've got a few bob lying around and they fancy a really big side of upside popping, right? So with that sentiment really bearish like this, it's difficult to buy gold. When it's bullish, it's relatively pain-free. You might say, well, but what does it look like if we were to look at it in the longer term? You know, how does it play out in the longer term? Well, you can see similar type of read into the bottom edge down here. When sentiment started to improve here, you can see that gold obviously was able to pick up some nice, decent accumulation longs. And when sentiment topped out at the top edge of Bitcoin, you can see that sentiment came crashing down there. Then, of course, gold's just annihilated to the downside. Can they go in opposite directions? Of course, they're completely different products. But what I am saying is that this is a sentiment product. And if it's a sentiment product, gold also has that sentiment sometimes available to try and read into, especially if there's a strong sentiment for Bitcoin in either direction. It gives us more of an idea. So when Bitcoin was getting murdered today, it's a strong negative sentiment for the space. Then there's a very good chance the fact that there's going to be a possible play coming into your gold market on the short side. It's just an extra side, guys, for you to remind yourself about how to read sentiment at times.